All right, today we have Reverend Otis Moss III with me. I am so excited. Reverend Otis, you have been such an important figure in my life over the last number of years. I remember, gosh, it must have been like 5 or 6 years ago, the first time I ever seen you preach. I think it might have been at like one of Jackie Lewis's, one of her conferences, or I don't even know anymore. I don't even remember. I've seen you preach a number of times, and I remember thinking to myself, wow, I don't know if I've ever seen somebody communicate, not even just preach, but just simply communicate the gospel better than you. I mean, it's pretty incredible. So it's really an honor for me to hang out and chat with you for a little bit. We'll want to talk about the new book that has come out a couple months ago now. But before then, you do a lot of things in the world. You are the senior pastor at Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago. You're obviously an author. You've written a number of books. But I'm curious, who is Reverend Otis Moss III to Reverend Otis Moss III?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for letting me be on the show, and so appreciative of your work and your witness for a people's theology. Just a tremendous, not only idea, but what you are casting out into the world. Just a
Well,
great
thank you.
bright light that you are providing. So thank you for the work you're doing, and thank you for having me on.
Yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
so appreciative of the conversation. I love the question. I just really appreciate that. Otis Moss is just simply a brother who deeply loves God, is committed to exploring how we can do work in the world for transformation. And I love movies and comic books, and I'm a basketball head too. Uh,
That
so,
all
so
all of those things are in the book and more.
without a doubt, yeah, all of all those pieces. But that's just really me. I'm kind of on an Enneagram. I'm very much a 4, 5, and a 9 for those who look
Oh,
at that
nice.
Enneagram stuff.
Love it, love it. Well, here's another little fun fact about you that I found that I didn't know about you before. But you used to run track, and you were an all-American track runner back in the day, many moons ago. Well, it's just I don't want to put an exact date on it because I don't want everybody to know how long ago it was. But let's
It
just
was a
say it was
while
many
back,
moons
but
ago.
back
What
in
I
the
was a track person too. I actually ran for a year or so in college. What did you do in track? What was your kind of event that you specialized in?
So I started out high jump, then long jump, and then moved into the to sprints 4x1, 1 and 200, but primarily was a jumper and a sprinter.
Really?
Mhm.
Love it. That's sweet. I ran 400s. I wasn't fast enough to do the hundreds or
Oh man,
200s.
400, that
And
is a serious race. That's the
yes,
race of courage. Uh,
yeah, you have to be a little dumb to run the 400.
that is the
And
race. And now the
and for
800 is now the race of courage. I think 400 and
yes.
800 runners are in the absolute best shape of anyone in track and field. Now there are other people who argue with me about that, but that 400 and
Yeah,
800 is a
those people are
serious
nuts.
race.
Yeah, they're something else. Yeah, again, I was too dumb and I was too slow to run anything else. So I got thrown into the 400, and fortunately it worked out for me well enough. But anyway, that's besides the point. Let's talk about the new book. It's called Dancing in the Darkness: Spiritual Lessons for Thriving in Turbulent Times. I'm really excited to chat about it. Before we get into kind of the content of the book, I want to hear a little bit more about you and the writing process and everything. What was something that you learned about yourself while you were writing this book that maybe you didn't know about yourself before? I know you've written other books, and I'm sure there's a lot of a learning process about yourself as you write books. But was there anything that came up in this book writing process where you're like, "Wow, did not know that about me"?
One of the things that I think I found out is that I was writing at first in a very academic manner,
Okay.
and that was a challenge. I'm so delighted that I had just a wonderful editor, and also a person who was working with me by the name of Greg Lynchenberg. And as I'm writing, it's like it's very academic. You're doing the academic thing. Then I would write again, and that's very sermonic. That's too sermonic. It's like, okay, how do you write for a broader audience? I know that I can write academically. I know that I can write sermonically, but
Mm-hmm.
how do you find that in between that has your voice, that is authentic? And that was a process. That was a real process because one of the pieces that we first turned in, the editor was like, "This is good, but I think you're framing this more like a long sermon." I was like, "Oh, okay, all right, we need to go back and work on this." Yeah, those are some of the things that I found out working on the book is learning a new literary voice
Mm,
is
mm.
that I developed over time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would imagine it's way different than, you did I think it was your Demon at CTS, and, you've written some other books. I know I read the preaching book way back in the day, and, there's certainly that's a different type of voice than what you're
Right.
trying to do here, and so I get that. There's certainly a balance that you're trying to do, and it's difficult when you're so much of your voice is on Sunday mornings, and to like figure out how does my voice sound differently, but it's still me in a different format. It's quite difficult. I don't know how much research you did in this book. I know a lot of this is kind of your own personal stories or
Mhm.
stories from your church or others that have been a part of your church and everything. So I don't know how much like theology you read or Bible stuff that you read for this book, but if there was any, was there anything new that came up where you're like, wow, I've never heard about that before theologically, or I've never heard about that
Mm.
biblically, or maybe you were researching some stuff about MLK and you're like, did not know that about him, or anything sort of like maybe more like uh, theological or biblical or even historical that you didn't know before. I'm always curious
That's
about those things
great.
that people didn't know.
Yeah, I appreciate these questions. So I did a deeper dive into King, a deeper
Okay.
dive into Howard Thurman. But one of the pieces that really didn't appear because we ended up cutting part of it off in the book, it was edited out, was a piece on the history of Auburn Avenue,
Mm.
where
Mm-hmm.
Dr. King grew up, that third ward in Atlanta, and really getting a complete, unique history of how this community not only nurtured him, but so many other activists during that time period of the 30s and the 40s. And then the second piece that just blew me away as I was doing research, talking about the history of racism and how we came up with the idea of whiteness and how
Mm-hmm.
blackness in itself, or I should say, black people went from African to becoming Negro and then the N word. How
Mm-hmm.
that came about, looking at the history of what was essentially the first African American couple that we have recorded who got married in the 1600s on this soil, and their experience absolutely blew me away. That here you
Mm.
had people who possibly owned one account that they had 700 acres of land. Another account said they had 500 acres of land, but that land was eventually removed from them. They were cheated out of it,
Mhm.
essentially, because the idea of racism began to, or what we consider to be the racialized imagination, began to appear. They were
Mhm.
at first just considered to be African people who were probably indentured servants. Then, as new laws came about, their ability to be able to negotiate in this colonial community began to be chipped away slowly and slowly and slowly to the point where they lost all of their wealth.
Mm.
And it was an amazing story of Antonio and Mary. Don't really know their last names, but it was Antonio and Mary that in the 1600s, this couple amassed an empire that was essentially taken from them. They would be one of the wealthiest, families in the southeastern United States today if they had been able to transfer their wealth down to their
Mm.
children, but they never were had that opportunity.
Yeah. One of the things that is really sobering is to learn about the history of racialization and the rise of white supremacy. It's super sobering, obviously, to learn about that, but then to also, I think what gives me hope is to also realize how socially constructed that was, which means then if it was socially constructed, we can socially construct ourselves to end white supremacy, to end that racialization. So, as much as it's very sobering, it also gives me a lot of hope that it is possible. It's going to take a hell of a lot of work, but it is possible, and that gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah, I appreciate that because it is true. I think when you read it, you understand how it's constructed and the fact that we can deconstruct this and we can create something new because it's purely a mythology that
Hmm.
we live out. We live out a particular mythology that people socially engineered in order to maintain power for a very, 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 very small group of people, and it affected not only people who are Black, but it affected people who are indigenous. It affected a large swath of people who were white. It was actually designed in many ways to keep Black people and white people from building coalitions
Hmm.
in order to overthrow people who were landowners, basically plantation owners in the South.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, let's talk about the book. At the beginning of the book, you talk about love and justice. And I grew up in a very conservative home where we were taught to love, but it wasn't until later on in my life that I realized that love and justice are they're intrinsically linked. And actually to love without justice is not to love at all. So
Mhm.
can you talk about how justice is essential and is linked to love?
Mhm. You know, in order for this democratic experiment that we call America to be able to flourish, I believe that the two values that are missing and are necessary are love and justice. And within
Mhm.
the theological and the faith, family and community, we have, as you mentioned, we've often separated love and justice. And love without justice is simply sentimentality.
Mm.
Justice without love becomes legalism and brutality. But the beautiful thing, when the two are together, because they want to be married and they want to produce children. And when they get married and they produce children, they always have at least two children, one by the name of liberation and the other by the name of transformation.
Mm.
And those two children grow up and begin to shift and change structures in the world. And the Black faith tradition, the Black spiritual tradition, has always uh, attempted to make sure that those two pieces were linked together.
Mm.
So justice in the American sense has been punishment and retribution. Justice within the gospel framework has always been distributive justice and restoration.
Mm.
How do we allow someone, hold them accountable, but then allow them to flourish and be better than what they used to be? And that's when love and justice come together.
Mm.
That I recognize the imprint of the divine on you. I hold you accountable, but I'm not holding you accountable just so that you may be tormented. But I
Mm.
hold you accountable because I want to see you restored. And for those of us within the faith community, we recognize that is what Jesus is attempting to do over and over again. That
Mhm.
I'm holding you accountable, but I want you to flourish. And that's the other Sunday I was mentioning, talking about that beautiful piece of scripture that says, "Let the redeemed of the Lord say so." That we are all collectively redeemed, that we are restored, we are renewed. And that's what true justice is about, the idea of renewing versus destroying.
Mm. I think even beyond that too, you could make the claim that for justice and love to be linked, at no point will that love and justice ever end. And
Yes.
this is totally besides the point, but like one of the things that I really get upset about the logics of hell is that at some point with the belief in hell, at some point somebody no longer is redeemable. At some point, no one that person is no longer be able to be restored. And I think if God is truly love and God is truly just, then that means that God will always be love and always will be just. And that means that that person will never, ever be outside of the bounds of God's love and justice. So
Man, you
God is always, even in the midst of what horrible things that person might do and say, at some point, God's love and justice, I think, will prevail. And
Yeah,
it may take
you
a while.
preaching now, man. You really you preaching. Because it's interesting that we have replaced Sheol, the land of the dead in the Jewish tradition, distance from God, into complete damnation of God's people. And
Mm.
that's a major leap that that we take,
Yeah.
distance from to damnation for all. It's a really
Mhm.
interesting thing, and it's a very more recent idea. And then
Yes.
here, we're trying to reclaim this ancient idea of a loving God, of a God that seeks us to operate create a just society, that we are constantly creating, as you said, and it takes it off the table. And that was a very fascinating thing that I never. My father's a pastor, and I never heard in my church one time the idea of this eternal damnation. It was
Mm,
always focused on this idea of a loving and just God who demands, holds us accountable, and wants us to flourish at our highest level of who we have been called to be.
mm. I love that. Let's talk about kind of later on in the book where you talk about chaos. And at the end of the chapter, you talk about silence. And I just think it's so powerful to think about how powerful silence is in the midst of chaos. Can you talk about how silence is powerful, especially in the midst of injustice and the chaos that happens during injustice?
It's, and I'm reminded really of what Jesus did when a group of men come to him and say, we need to stone this sister, and he's silent and starts writing in the dirt,
Mm,
and then speaks, "The one who is without sin cast the first stone." And I've always wondered what happened in that silent period, because the scripture says, "And the old men left first," which absolutely cracks me up, which means that they had a larger collection of things that they'd done. They said they were creeping out with their finger up, like, "Excuse me." Um, they would need to leave out. So the power of silence is because our vocabulary is so deeply broken that we're unable to fully articulate what is sacred, what is divine. It's always inarticulate. It's always broken and um, off the mark.
mm,
If it was a bow and an arrow, we would always be missing. We wouldn't even be hitting the target. We'd be somewhere in the vicinity, but we never hit the target.
hmm
And so silence is one of the ways in which we can reclaim our ear versus our voice, to
mm,
be able to hear what the spirit is speaking. And when chaos arrives, it allows us in that moment to be able to discover what are the particular laws that are functioning. For example, they tell you when you fall into the water and you think you're going to drown, one of the things you have to do is you have to calm down, you have to slow down, and which is counterintuitive. If you otherwise you'll be be taken by the waves. In track, as
mm,
you ran, they told you run relaxed,
hmm
counterintuitive, that you have to run with your body completely relaxed, but it seems that your body's trying to tell you you have to stiffen up.
hmm
Silence is one of the ways in order to literally run relaxed,
mm,
so that we can calm our spirits, regain our ear, and then figure out what are the laws that are operating that we need to harness in the moment of our chaos, just like a sailor. Sailors understand chaos completely. They know I don't control the waves, I don't control the wind, but if I put my sail in the right position, I can capture the wind and utilize that particular physical law to get me to land, but I can't travel to land directly. I have to tack left and right, left and right. So I have to be nimble enough. Martial arts, same thing. They teach you, especially in Aikido, when the person is attacking you, use their energy. But the only way you can do that is that you have to be quiet enough, still enough to be able to witness that your opponent, not your enemy, but your opponent, energy can be used to your advantage.
mm. It reminds me of the best comedians know how to use silence most
Oh, come on.
powerfully, right? The best comedians are so good at using silence, and that's part of what makes their magic in their
Mhm,
humor so
mhm.
good. And it also reminds me, I just watched this documentary about Mr. Rogers and how good he was at using silence with children. Right? We think about like a classroom and you think that you constantly have to create energy and you have to constantly create stimulation to keep the attention of these children. And Mr. Rogers did the opposite. He would use silence to capture that attention with children. It's really it's just incredibly powerful. But whether you're a comedian or you're a children's communicator.
That's so good. Mr. Rogers is one of my favorite just people in general, and the brilliance of his ministry. That's just spot on. Um, the manner in which he will pause and literally slow down
Hmm.
when intuitively the way that things are produced now, you're supposed to ramp up, speed up. But there are these quiet moments in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood where he'll say, "Let's sit down together now, children," in this quiet voice. And
Hmm.
there'll be a pause. And then he'll ask a question. There'll be another pause. It's fascinating that he's using contemplative uh, Christian methodology
Right.
order to teach children how to be fully human and engage civically and to live a life of compassion and love, regardless of their faith tradition. He's using these very ancient principles in his teaching.
Absolutely. Yeah, there was this moment in that documentary where it had kind of a compilation of these moments where he would literally, for like an entire minute, just be doodling around with something on like this is on air, and he's doodling around, maybe doing a craft or whatever, but he's doing it quietly and silently. And it's like there's no way you would ever see that in children's programming anymore,
Right.
ever, where
No,
you would have a minute of silence. I can't imagine seeing anything like
we
that
just
anymore. But yeah.
demand, yeah, we demand noise. So, you reminded me when you mentioned Mr. Rogers and about comedians, I thought about Thelonious Monk,
Mm.
where Thelonious Monk says that music is not in the chords, it's in the silence between the
Mm-hmm.
notes.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that's where you make music. And I think if we think of that on a spiritual level, that's where the Holy Spirit is loose, where the mischief is called and caused, is
Mm-hmm.
in that silence in between. That's where things are created and worlds are born, is in the silence.
Yeah, love that. You talk about later on in the book about liberation and specifically liberation listening, where when we share with one another our hurts and our pain and maybe even our joys with one another, and when we truly listen to each other, I think that's maybe when liberation happens. And it reminds me of one of the things I did my thesis a year ago now on embodiment, specifically like in
Mm,
embodied theology. And I did a lot of research around like the science of embodiment, like what's actually happening in our bodies. And one of the things I found was that our bodies are really good at mirroring each other. When we're in a really deep relationship and we're close with one
mhm,
another, our hearts will start to,
mhm.
like when we're cuddling with a loved one, our hearts actually start to beat at the same rhythm. And and there's a million other things that our bodies do when we're in deep relationship with one another. And yeah, I just think that this is so powerful that when we actually talk about liberation and we talk about like a listening liberation, it's not just some abstract idea, but our bodies actually begin to empathize with one another. They begin to mirror one another. And yeah, I just think that's just really incredible to see like what you're describing in the spiritual practice of liberation listening, and how that actually happens within our bodies. Like our bodies actually start to feel not just one another's pain
Mm,
and hurt and joys, but our bodies actually start to react with one another in that way. And I just find
man.
that really, really incredible. I don't know. I don't know if I have a specific question around that, but I'm just curious. I don't know. Maybe you have thoughts, comments around that.
Well, I mean, I think you're right on target, once again, and the beauty of being in relationship, deep relationship with someone, and not just a loved one, but when we're dialoguing with each other, when we're learning about each other's culture, family, whatever it may be, that there is a shift in the manner in which we communicate, we act, and our bodies react to it. Same thing happens with music. Same thing happens when people cook and
Hmm.
are, having a meal together, when there's laughter together, and when something deep and moving is shared, when we decide to be vulnerable together. I think the research also points to the same thing, that our heartbeats begin to shift a little bit, and our movements begin to mirror each other. Children do it all the time, that they mirror adults, especially adults that they have a close relationship with. That's why it's very important for people that what they believe, what they live, what they share will always be picked up by a young person
Mm,
or a small child. And small children are amazing observers, but they are terrible interpreters. So they will mimic you, but they may not understand why you are doing what you do. And they will
mm,
come up with their own reasoning. And sometimes they will carry with them some very painful baggage because no one took the time to tell them the why and explain why dad does this or why mom does this or why brother or uncle operates that way, and they carry that with them. But
mm,
that's part of, well, we got to learn how to listen and slow down and share.
mm. You mentioned at the beginning about Dr. King and learning about the neighborhood that he had grown up in and how that shaped him in his ministry. How does knowing our origins aid us in the movement of liberation? And whether this is a maybe a person of color or another oppressed, marginalized person, or a person who maybe carries more dominant identities. Like how does, regardless of where you maybe the identities you may have, how do knowing the origins aid us in that movement of liberation?
Well, there's power in story. That's how human beings function. We
Mm,
share stories. That's how we transfer information and build relationships. But the other piece is, it means that our origin story, we can decide what that story is going to be. I'm not saying you make up something, but what I'm saying is, if you have an experience that's painful, and that's what the point in the book talking about superheroes and villains are essentially the same individuals. They just there's a nexus moment, there's a crossroad that they hit. And one group says, I will use this so that I may become better. And another group says, I'm going to use this and just become bitter.
mm,
Two-Face in the DC world, he has an incident, a painful incident, and all of a sudden it destroys his spirit and he becomes this villain. Um, but then you look at someone like Batman, and he has a painful experience. He becomes an anti gun billionaire, essentially vigilante activist and detective because of the painful situation that he had. So when we have a moment, we can make the decision. We have the power of choice. And so reworking your origin story is all about
mm,
looking at my story. Do I rest in this idea that um, I am a victim, or that I have to live in this cesspool of pain, whatever it may be? You can choose, and you can choose to have that past be empowering or that past be destructive. And you can take the stories of your ancestors, and everyone has stories in their family that are extraordinary.
mm.
The stories of your grandparents, your aunts, uncles, people in your neighborhood. Listen to those stories, and they are absolutely transformative when you realize that people of a different generation, what they were able to do, what they went through, what they experienced without all of the resources that we have today, is something that is truly inspiring. And
Mm.
that's a part of reworking our origin story and shaping our story so they become empowering and not something that is destructive.
Yeah, that's interesting from like and maybe you have similar kind of reflections on your own origin stories around this, but I often will talk to my grandparents about our ancestors and how they came to America and all of that. And I hear some of these stories and I think to myself, how did I grow up then in a family that would have otherwise probably been oppressive to this person who immigrated to America? They were poor. They were looking for a new way of life. They were looking for a new life, and there were women who were strong and powerful, and and yet I also grew up in a family where, feminism was looked down upon, where, it's all about becoming wealthy. And, there's just this very like conservative type of way of living and being. But hear the stories that they tell me, and I'm like, how do you not see the disconnect happening here? And so I don't know, like maybe you have similar kind of reflections on how our origin stories somehow don't always end up making that connection to others and the story that we grew up in. And so I'm curious, do you have experiences like that where
You know,
you reflect on like how did my origin story of these amazing, incredible people, and how did we end up still believing some of these really harmful things?
I think everyone does because we are, fully human with an imprint of God's DNA on us. That God put God's fingerprint on every
Mm,
single one of us. I always like to joke, but very seriously, if you had some spiritual luminol like from CSI and started just squirting a bottle on us, you would see fingerprints, the fingerprints of God, and all of us have these stories of horns and halos that everyone has this possibility of doing something angelic and beautiful, and we also have these moments of doing something that is destructive and terrible within our families. And I think that we have to learn how to embrace the totality of those stories. In my own family, we were always valorized in many ways uh, the affirming pieces of those stories. But then
mm,
there is another side of some of my ancestors who chose to turn away from the power and the greatness that was within their own DNA. And that might have gone down a bottle, that might have gone down what we would now call today mental health
mm,
challenges, because they were afraid to share their struggles.
mm,
As a man in the 1930s and 40s, you don't share your struggles.
mm,
You just leave home and leave everybody, because you don't want anybody to know that you have any struggles. So it's amazing to see that some take hold of their story and find power, and then others take hold of their story and assume a different posture.
mhm,
All of us have it, and I think that for our generation, for your generation, that it's important that we acknowledge. That's what Flannery O'Connor talks about. You have to acknowledge the brokenness to see the beauty of grace. That there is
mm,
no grace unless there's brokenness, because grace is only witness and only can be used for those who have been broken. If you're
mm,
perfect, grace doesn't stop by. Uh, but for the rest of us, it comes by. For those of us who have been broken, are in deep need of those moments.
mhm. One of the things that has always just remained core to Jesus's teachings, or at least, the way even though I grew up very conservative and have changed my theology completely, one of the things that just has always stuck with me is that core to Jesus's teachings is forgiveness, and forgiveness of our enemies or opponents, as you've described it. And it's really interesting as I've gotten more involved with justice folks, especially those who are not necessarily in the Christian tradition. A lot of times there's like a skepticism about forgiveness, and I understand why. And you talk about that kind of forgiveness in the book. Can you talk about what does forgiveness actually look like in a world that's just? What does forgiveness look like that is also just?
Mm, yeah, yeah. I think in the modern American context, forgiveness is rooted in absolution, especially for communities that have been marginalized. Certainly within the African American community, other communities have demanded, "Oh, we want you to forgive us." Essentially, we don't want you to talk about anything else. We don't want you to talk about your rage and your passion and
Mm,
your deep hurt and pain. We don't want to hear that. It makes us too uncomfortable. And for some, when they hear forgiveness, they are thinking it's absolution. They're thinking, because again, our words are so inarticulate, and the manner in which what we say and how people receive it, because they have all of these things that are going on with them. They can't hear the word. That's why I always have real issues with, certain academics or people who are outside of a particular community trying to frame what the community is actually saying. It's like, you're
Mm,
not a part of it. You never asked the question. You just went and borrowed somebody else's definition. So forgiveness really has nothing to do with the person who has injured you. It has everything to do with saying that I refuse to carry your water anymore.
mm,
I no longer will allow your image, your words, your spirit to have a portion of my heart. We're not going out, hanging out. We're not buddies now. But no longer, when I hear your voice, when I hear your name, do you make my spirit shudder, because I've released you from having power over me.
mm,
That's what forgiveness is. It is something that the person who has been injured gives to themselves and then puts them in a position, if the person takes on accountability, where there can be some form of reconciliation down the road.
mm,
Dr. King says that the problem with the American justice system is that we want retribution, and you can murder a murderer, but you cannot murder. You can execute the liar,
mm,
but you cannot end lying. And often in our country, we want to elevate the fact that we have jailed and then executed this individual as if it's some great triumph. But justice and love keeps coming back. How do you restore so that we do not continue to repeat the same actions over and over and over again?
right. It brings us back to that first conversation we had where damning somebody, whether it's damning them to hell or damning them to a jail cell, is not accountability. That is an avoidance of accountability,
That's right.
right?
Right.
And I think it's similar in that way of, a forgiveness that is just trying to be absolution
Mhm.
is not that there's no accountability in there, and it's
Right.
actually therefore an avoidance of accountability. And that's where I think if we actually truly have forgiveness that is is ingrained
Mm.
with accountability, that's where I think maybe that true transformation happens.
It really does. It really is. I say in the book, I use the example of the Mbembe tribe in Southern Africa.
Mm,
When someone violates the rules of society, usually a young person, is this technique is utilized. They bring that young person into a circle with all of the elders and other young people and mothers and fathers and uncles. And that young person has to stand in that circle while all the elders, they don't say, "Why did you do this?" They sit there and each one, they go around the circle and talk about how amazing this young person is and what potential you have. And they do it over and over again
mm,
until the young person breaks down crying, and they want to restore themselves. They want to redeem themselves in the eyes of the community and live up to the gifts that are inherent within their own spirit. That's restoration. That's
mhm,
causing someone accountability, instead of saying, you're a terrible person, we want to excommunicate you from the community. The community comes together and said, you were not born for this.
yeah,
This is not who you are. Do you know your mother and father prayed for you, and that we celebrated you in your mother's belly? And when you came out, they just go on and on and on until the young person just can't take it anymore.
mhm,
That they
mhm,
weep. That's an extraordinary act of justice right there,
mhm.
and accountability.
Yeah, I was talking with somebody recently where they were like, if we actually took Jesus's commandment about loving our neighbors, if we actually did that, like our actual neighbors around our neighborhood, if we actually did that, I don't think there would be a need for jails and prisons anymore
Mhm,
because
mhm,
we would actually love our neighbor to hold them accountable and restore them. And we wouldn't need to ship them off and again excommunicate them from the
mhm.
neighborhood. I think that's just a really powerful. Like, if we actually did this, it would be an entirely different world. And I think it's again, I think it's
Yeah,
possible. It's a world that's possible.
without a doubt.
Towards the end of the book, you talk about grace, and you finish the chapter with this incredible story where you talk about your father being introduced by Dr. King and a Nazi trying to rush the stage. Can you share that story? I just think everybody needs to hear this story. This is an incredible story. Can you share that story and then talk
Sure.
about why is grace so powerful when it comes to justice? Why is grace
Mm,
so powerful when
mm.
it comes to that? Yeah.
So the story is, my father was to he was to speak, and he was a lieutenant in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Also, was one of the organizers for what was the Atlanta Sit-in Movement, or the Movement for Human Rights was the name that they had chosen during that time period in the late 50s and the 60s. And he was to speak. And I'm not sure what I forgot the city. Was that Albany? I'm trying to remember the city where he's supposed to be speaking. And Dr. King was introducing him when this self-professed Nazi runs the stage and attacks Dr. King and begins to pummel him. Uh, of course, the other bodyguards, they grab him, pull him back, and Dr. King specifically communicates to them not to harm this person, do not pummel him back. And the gentleman was expecting to be attacked by these extremely large, buff brothers who were also working in the movement. But instead, they laid hands on him. They laid hands on him in a different way.
Hmm.
They began to pray and praying that the spirit that was causing him, that spirit of a racial hatred, that spirit of white supremacy, would be removed from him.
Hmm.
And they say that the man was literally dazed and confused when the police showed up, because he kept saying they should have attacked me. He wanted them to attack him to prove
Right.
his point, essentially. But he couldn't understand why they didn't operate the way that he had envisioned, with the same type of hatred he had for them. And in the book, I talk about that he was left dazed and confused, and he was also left amazed by grace in the process. And when grace functions, this unmerited, this unwarranted act that shows up, for us, it's a humbling act. And when we are amazed by grace, how it operates in small ways, little graces that we experience, and on a larger scale, it humbles us and causes us to pass grace to other people. And that's something
Hmm.
that we don't do very often in civic society. That we don't often pass on grace, say our grace, and give grace in a variety of ways. And it's essential in justice, because there are moments where there have to be grace moments, just period. Especially, and I believe this fervently, especially for young people, for juvenile quote unquote offenders. We've got to have a grace system, a system of accountability, and a system of grace, that we see young people not as evil and destructive, but just like the Mabembe tribe, they would say you have great potential, and grace needs to operate in those moments. And I think that our society, our world, our educational system would be much better if we had just a touch of grace.
It does really. I think that the story of this Nazi that rushed the stage and attacked MLK, it reminds me of this tribe too, where it's like the men that prayed over him are basically doing a very similar thing to what this tribe does with a child that might have not been doing the right thing, where it's like you're praying over him the truth about who he is,
Mm,
that
mhm.
he is not a person that has to submit to white supremacy.
Right.
He is a child of God, and then if he lives into being a child of God, there can be reconciliation, and that there can be love between all these folks.
Yeah.
And it's really powerful then when you hear the truth about who you really are, and that
Right.
you don't have to be this child to the demon of white supremacy, to the child of the demon of homophobia and sexism, right? That when you realize that you actually are the child of God, a child of God, that will radically change who you are,
Yes.
and you lived a transformed life.
You know, he was wearing Nazi clothes, but he wasn't born a Nazi.
Right.
And most of the time when we are operating in a destructive manner, we're just wearing those clothes. I mean, that we and those clothes can be removed, and you can put on some new clothes. And then if you continue to walk, you can walk in your full authenticity of who you are. But those are the kind of conversations that we have to have on a civic level of what kind of nation do we want, what type
Hmm.
of world do we want to create, and what type of faith community will we be a part of, and what is our vocation and project as a human being? What have we been called to? What light are we going to bring into a room?
Hmm. At the end of the book, you share this story of the West Baptist, or the
What's
Westboro
the
Baptist Church
Mhm.
protesting at your church, and how many of your church members resisted them by making sure people got into your church safely. And I think this is just an incredible example of how resistance is love. And it also reminds me of people just living into what Aishan Crowley has described as the otherwise world, where you
Mhm.
just live into what the world that we imagine, the world that we hope for, the world that we long, live like that, regardless and in resistance to the world that's actually happening. And maybe you'll actually start to see you'll actually see the world change and transform in the way that we hope and long for. And I'm just curious, around, when it comes to a story like that of the Westboro Baptist Church protesting your church, and your church resisting that, uh, can you talk about how those moments of resistance, that the moments where you're living into that otherwise world, is a moment of love? Because
Mm.
at the end of the day, this is what this book is about: love and justice. And so I'm curious how those kind of connect when you actually live into it, where you're not going to live into what the protester, the Westboro Baptist Church, is demanding of you. You're living into an otherwise world. And so, anyway, I don't know if that's articulate or not,
No,
but
no, no,
whatever
complete
your thoughts, comments on that are, I'd love
yes,
to hear
great,
it.
great, great question, and I'm glad you brought that up. It's really an act of with sacred serendipity, the sacred serendipity of God in that moment when we found out that Westboro Baptist Church, I really don't like putting church at the end of because it just doesn't fit the Westboro people. Let me put it that way because I think it's so disingenuous and kind of a false narrative to associate them in any way with anything that Jesus does, even if it's just at a great distance. But
Hmm.
nonetheless, so we found out that morning we're going into worship that Westboro is outside and they are protesting. They're protesting. They've got these signs and they have cameras. They're protesting then Senator Barack Obama using very racialized language, I might add. And they're also screaming and hollering at people going into church. So I'm concerned. I'm worried. I'm like, oh gosh. I said, what are we going to do? For several reasons. One, Westboro is trying to get on video a confrontation. And
Mm,
Westboro understands the racialized imagination. No matter how, they may operate, how cruel they may be, if they get a black person on camera, it will go viral and be used in these kind of conservative circles as exhibit one of here is this community Barack Obama comes out of, and they are X, Y, and Z.
right.
And then we just go through a whole nother media gauntlet, and it creates its own little narrative from there. So, and that's when the spirit was really clear. and the choir was marching in the church. I mean, they had their robes, they had their walk, they're doing their thing, they're marching in church. And I stopped them and I said, look, we've got the Westboro people outside, and they're saying some horrific things about Senator Obama. They're saying horrific things about our church. They're saying these terrible things. This is what I need you all to do. You all are in your choir robes. I need you to do some ministry right now. I need you to go outside. I need you to surround, each of you surround one of these people who have bullhorns. And I need you to sing This Little Light of Mine as loud as you can so no one can hear anything that they're saying, so people can come into church peacefully and their sounds will be drowned out by the glory that you are bringing. And the choir was all in. Man, I gotta tell you, I mean, they were just like, "Oh, okay, we got you, Rev, we got you." And so they roll out, they surround these protesters, and I don't think the choir has ever sung, offered sounds at this level ever in their life. Uh,
It's like, why
and
can't you do that on Sundays usually?
I mean, they have assistants. This is I mean, without a microphone, the sound was so powerful that it just completely drowned out every racialized, horrific word coming from these people. And there's the image that I always have is I remember there's several one of the ladies named Hattie, and Hattie has this amazing voice. I mean, and she stands all of like 5'1". Okay. Miss Hattie is just bad to the bone. And Miss Hattie is looking up at this guy who's like 6'4", and there's about 5 other elders with Miss Hattie around this man, and they're all little, but they're just clapping, and their voices are so powerful. The man, they've never touched him. He keeps moving backwards until he falls in the street. And I'm just like, that is the power of love and justice merged together.
Mm.
Here is a community that recognizes that we are loved by God, who we are. We're rooted in who we are. We're unapologetic. We're unashamed of who we are. And we're going to use our sonic ability to change the words that are coming out of the mouths and from the lips of those who've come to do us harm. It was a beautiful thing to see. But what was
Mm.
more powerful is after they were finished, you know, Westboro, they went and got in there, they looked half drunk, got in their van and drove off. But when they came into church, when the choir came into church after that, as God is my witness, I've never heard the choir sing like that in my life. I've never heard the choir sing like that since. It was the most unbelievable sound I have ever heard in my life in a church. It was if I don't know, it was like God's voice inhabited the songs, and it was at a level that we almost just shut down everything in church and just let them just sing the entire time, because it was I've never seen a spiritual ruckus like that, and all because they decided to stand up, and two forces that were attempting to destroy, they became so deeply empowered in the moment.
Who would have thought that the best way to do some exercises before you record some vocals is to go protest the Westboro Baptist folks? Maybe next time the choir goes to record, maybe that's
There's
the way
so many
that
ways
they
to do it.
yeah,
You know, you get your
that's the way
voice
to get their voice nice
set,
and
you get
ready.
level set, get the level set. That's how you do your sound check.
Dr. Reverend Moss, the tagline of my podcast is called Exploring, Inspiring, and Liberating Theology. So, how do you hope Dancing in the Darkness inspires and liberates its readers?
You know, I pray that the book will cause people to reflect, that it will cause people to go deeper in terms of this idea of love and justice, and also make people uncomfortable with the way that they're looking at the world, looking at themselves, looking at other people, and believe that, you know what, it is possible for me with my little voice, with my little corner of the world, that I can contribute something to this yet to be United States of America,
Mhm.
uh, and help create something that is not yet, but hopefully will be, as we continue to trust and to do the work day by day.
Yeah, and the biggest thing is it is possible. I have to constantly remind myself in the midst of all the injustice, another world is still possible,
It
and
is.
that's the hope that I live into and I try to.
Well, you're doing it. You're definitely doing it with this podcast for
Thank
sure.
you.
So
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Reverend Moss, last question. How can listeners get connected to you and your work?
Certainly. You can connect with us at Trinity United Church of Christ on the south side of Chicago. If you're ever in Chicago, just come visit us on the south side, the best side of Chicago. You can check me out on Twitter at OM3 and Instagram at Otis Moss III. Or you can check us out on Unashamed Media. That's our media arm. We produce films and
Mm,
podcasts, and we've even done some music projects and poetry, and other unique aspects, trying to just lift people's spirits and also have them reflect on some of the destructive aspects of our society. Let me put it that way.
mhm.
But those are some different ways that you can connect with us, and we'd love to be in dialogue with you. And if you're ever in Chicago, you got to come by Trinity.
Will love it. I mean, hopefully I'll be in Chicago sometime soon. I've been there plenty of times, but I will definitely come on by and hang out. It would be a great time, especially on a Sunday. It would be wonderful.
Yes, yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. You got to come by and see. You haven't been to Chicago until you've come to visit Trinity, and then you also got to make sure that you get some a good hot dog and some popcorn while you're here.
That's right. That's right. Well, Reverend Otis Moss, again, it's been an honor to chat with you, to chat about the new book. It's just really, really incredible. So thank you so much for chatting a little bit more about it.
My pleasure. Thank you so very much for having me.